Over the past few years, Bethesda has been rebooting single-player FPS games to great success. 2014's Wolfenstein: The New Order took everyone by surprise and redeemed what was otherwise one of the most lackluster years in video games. Then last year's Doom came along and, once again, took everyone by surprise and was one of the best games of the year. Seemingly continuing this trend, Bethesda then announced a reboot of Prey, a cult classic from 2006. The anomaly was that this Prey had nothing in common with 2006's Prey, or the infamously cancelled Prey 2. I didn't care about that though. The game still looked interesting to me and became one of my most anticipated games of 2017. In Prey, the player becomes Morgan Yu, an accomplished scientist and director at TranStar, a scientific megacorporation that created neuromods, which are a human enhancement technology. These neuromods copy the abilities of humanity's most talented individuals and transfer them over to anyone willing to shove a needle directly into their brain. In the opening scene of the game, Morgan is undergoing various psychological tests, which are revealed to be happening in a loop. After alien specimens known as Typhons break free, Morgan is also able to free himself from this looping simulation. Without any recollection of who he is, Morgan is set loose on a massive space station overrun by these hostile alien organisms, with no choice but to attempt to make sense of things. Going in, I did have some concerns about the PC version of the game. Prey was developed by Arcane Studios, whose last release, Dishonored 2, was an absolute nightmare on PC. Add on to that the demo that was dropped ahead of the game's release date on both PS4 and Xbox One, but was worryingly absent from PC. Oddly enough, on release day, the game had no notable performance issues on PC, and was praised as being a great port. This might have to do with Prey running on the CryEngine rather than Arcane's own in-house engine. The first thing I noticed when I started playing was the atypical placement of the reticle. Instead of it being at the center of the screen like the majority of FPS games, it's placed on the bottom third of the screen like Halo 2 and 3. Presumably, the intention here was to help the player aim at the mimics, which are low to the ground and serve as this game's common grunt enemy. Nice in theory, but it stops being helpful and starts being obnoxious when you're fighting 8-foot-tall phantoms and massive hovering blobs. When there's no choice but to aim up, it feels like walking around with your head tilted back because you have a nosebleed and can't find a tissue. I got used to it after a while, but it's so painfully unnecessary and harms more than it helps. Other than that annoyance, the combat and movement are generally competent, if a tad bit stilted. Aiming has a slower, more methodical feel, which would be fine if the enemies weren't as fast as they are. Certain phantoms will teleport around at breakneck speeds and can be difficult to hit until they're at point-blank range. Early moments of the game have the player use the glue cannon to freeze enemies and then smash them with a wrench or shoot them with the pistol. It's similar to Overwatch's Mei, but far more clunky and difficult to pull off in practice. The gameplay here is just too slow to accommodate a mechanic like this in a natural way, and I can't even begin to imagine how hard it is to play on console. On PC, you can at least use the number keys to switch weapons quickly and bypass the slow-mo weapon wheel that becomes a cluttered mess by the end of the game. Prey has what felt like two distinct gameplay phases. There's the first third of the game, and then there's the rest of the game. The first third severely limits ammo to the point of feeling like a survival game. The issue is, it doesn't play like a survival game in that first third. It plays like an arcadey shooter where you have no ammunition or supplies. Every phantom fight becomes an ammo check rather than a fun, dynamic encounter. Oftentimes, I would find myself just running past the enemies as if I were doing a Dark Souls speedrun, which is never a good feeling to have on the first playthrough of a game. It does redeem itself gameplay-wise in the latter two-thirds, since the slight stiffness of the gameplay doesn't rear its ugly head as often when you're not obsessed with conserving as much ammunition as possible. Running through a room filled with half a dozen phantoms with a fully loaded shotgun can be somewhat reminiscent of Doom. It's to the point where I wonder why Prey's gunplay couldn't have taken a few notes from Doom. Even games like Metro and BioShock that are more methodical like Prey have far smoother gameplay. By far, the most noteworthy combat this game has to offer are the fights with the poltergeist enemy type. The first few run-ins I had were genuinely creepy and disorienting. As its name would imply, objects in the room they occupy begin to rattle and move on their own, and the enemy itself is actually invisible. They can detain you with a UFO tractor beam, and once they do that, you can roughly estimate where they are and kill them. However, the game does find a way to ruin this enemy type. You'll backtrack to an early area only to find it inhabited by 3 of these fuckers, and at that point it becomes a nuisance that's impeding your progress rather than something cool. Aside from the combat, the neuromods serve as Prey's other large gameplay mechanic. Almost everything you can do in the game is tied to a neuromod, and these neuromods can manifest themselves in different ways. Some are combat abilities that are extremely similar to BioShock's plasmids, while other more passive abilities enable minigames such as hacking. Because everything you can do is a neuromod, the neuromod upgrade tree is kind of insane. There are just too many nodes on the neuromod menu, and it's made worse by certain abilities having multiple tiers. One ability, Leverage, has 3 tiers, and I'm not sure why. The higher level versions only allow you to pick up heavier objects, so they exist simply to fill up the tree and suck up the moderately rare neuromod upgrades. There's also a lot of nodes that feel frustratingly mandatory. Around the station, you'll run into broken power junction boxes that spew out electrical charges that have huge range and do enough damage to easily kill you. Sure, you can shoot them with the glue cannon, but that fix will only last for half a minute. If you want to permanently disable them, you have to unlock the repair ability, which I'd wager almost everyone that played this game did. Another great example is the weapon upgrade neuromod that locks off higher level weapon upgrades. The problem with it is that you already have to use weapon kits to upgrade weapons, so all this ability does is stop you from using the perfectly good weapon kits you already have if you don't unlock it, or force you to use up a neuromod on a rather bland ability. There are some cool abilities here like Mimic Matter and useful ones that do damage to enemies, but I would have liked to see some of these more bland upgrade nodes replaced with more game-changing ones. The exploration is the real highlight of Prey. The way in which the rooms are structured and have items strewn throughout them is believable and enticing to rummage through. Items that were meant to be hidden were hidden in a convincing way, things like a sticky note underneath a desk with a password on it and a missing security badge that had a globe on top of it. A lot of the items in these rooms serve a practical purpose though. They can be melted down into individual resources by the recycler machine and turned into usable items. Even duplicate weapons can be melted down and made into ammo. I found this mechanic to be one of the most streamlined in the game, as just about every item and its resulting resources have a good purpose. At no point did I ever find myself with a stack of items that I had no use for. There are a staggering amount of rooms and areas that are completely inaccessible without first using an ability or mechanic. I kept finding rooms that were blocked off by half-broken doors that I assumed would be destructible later on in the game, and it wasn't until halfway through that I thought to use the Mimic Matter ability to turn myself into a small object and roll myself in. There are clearly ways to tackle these obstacles that the developers intended, but you can also bullshit your way past if you're clever enough. Want to stack a dozen crates to bypass a hacking minigame like this guy? No problem. Despite some of the positive things I've said, I still had times where I would turn the game off after 20 minutes, and I likely wouldn't have finished the game if I didn't want to make this review. Those elements that range from decent to good are dragged down to mediocre by the wrapping they're encapsulated in. Prey lacks a sense of urgency, a hook that pulls you in and stops you from putting the game down even though it's 3 AM. At first, I thought the problem was me, that I just wasn't feeling it and needed to progress deeper into the game before that hooking moment happened, but it never did. Instead, Prey has a serious case of low energy. I haven't commented on the story yet, and that's because 90% of the story happens in the first hour of the game. Imagine if BioShock had its would you kindly moment in the first hour of the game. Not only would that moment be diminished to the point of meaninglessness, but it would ruin any curiosity the player had for the rest of the game. There'd be no grand reveal the player had to look forward to. That is exactly what Prey does in its prologue. The big reveal is that you're on this spaceship, but how is that exciting when the game has just begun and I have no context or reason to care? The cutscenes are limited to the opening and ending moments of the game, and the majority of phone call exposition is all but irrelevant to building up the world and narrative of Prey. The cast is incredibly small, and made even smaller by the numerous inessential members. All of the cast members have one thing in common. They're all as boring as watching paint dry.
It's good to see you. Is TranStar mounting a rescue operation? I was in fuel storage when the fire broke out and everyone began running. But they weren't running from the fire, it was these shapes. I had contained the fire and I was trying to reach the power supply when Officer Rose, came and got me out. I'm glad he did. I didn't know what was going on or anything about those things.
The writing and voice acting are incomprehensibly lifeless. I've never heard someone talk about grave, humanity-threatening subject matter in such a blasé way as these characters. I'm not asking for every line to be shouted at the highest possible volume, but the lack of enthusiasm in the delivery just sucks any and all energy out of this game. The biggest offender here is the player character's older brother, Alex Yu. His tone of voice makes it seem as if a hostile takeover of his trillion-dollar space station is an annoyance on par with finding out it's Sunday after driving to Chick-fil-A.
The device you mentioned, it's an advanced version of the null wave. It's the only way to stop the Typhon without destroying everything we've been working toward. We're just missing some scan data from the Coral to complete the design. Help me finish this, Morgan. And then, you can have my arming key. I don't believe you want to use it anymore, but you can have it. I left the chip set for you on my desk. You'll need to upgrade your psychoscope to scan the Coral. I'll send you the scan locations.
There are moments where the game will tell you to drop everything and go rescue some people who only have 15 minutes to live, and even that can't manage to introduce some urgency into the game. When those moments happened, I didn't have a care in the world, I only did them out of fear of getting a bad ending.
This is Dr. Dayo Igwe. I'm broadcasting to all contacts in proximity. Please, whoever is out there, listen to me. Oxygen is low and I have no spacesuit. An accident in cargo bay forced me to seal myself inside this container, but I have no way to dock with the station from in here.
This game doesn't even attempt to make its world or atmosphere interesting. Talos 1 is littered with computer systems that are chock full of emails, but almost all of the ones that I read were either mere banter between ancillary staff members or dry, needless information about technical aspects of Talos 1. Maybe there was something interesting in those emails, but I never saw it. It's a Destiny 1 Grimoire card type situation where there might be some worthwhile bits of information sprinkled in, but the sheer amount of filler dilutes that pool to the point where no player could ever be expected to find that potentially good content, even if it did exist. Also, in case you were wondering, no, there is no connection to the original Prey or the cancelled Prey 2. No hint that they're in a shared universe, not even a cheeky Easter egg. The visuals are technically competent, and the sci-fi Art Deco style is interesting, but like The Last Guardian, it gets old quick when the different areas don't have much of anything to differentiate them. The game does take place on one persistent space station, but that doesn't mean that every single area has to look identical. Even the soundtrack is low energy and contributes to the boring atmosphere. Much to my surprise, the soundtrack here was done by the same guy who did last year's Doom, which featured one of the best soundtracks I've ever heard in a game. It's hard to believe because Prey's soundtrack doesn't play that often, and when it does, it's mostly ambient sounds rather than actual tracks. It's as if the game was made backwards, with all of the technical stuff being done first and the creative side of things being a complete afterthought that was retrofitted onto what was already there. In contrast to games that place style over function, Prey's core gameplay is held back by its severe lack of personality and style. Prey is definitely not a bad game, but it's not good, decent, or even above average. It exists in this 5 out of 10 purgatory. This is one of those games where you pick it up, play it for 2 hours, and then never come back to it. Not out of disdain for the game, but just apathy for it. It's a game so devoid of life that I can't even be bothered to hate it. Prey is not BioShock in space. Prey is BioShock's boring cousin.